Hey there, welcome to the Native Flow English. I'm Sarah, and I'm really excited to have you join us. Let me ask you a few questions before we jump into today's episode. Have you ever struggled to understand what people are saying in English? Or maybe you've been trying to improve your English, but you're not seeing the results you're hoping for? What if I told you that in just 30 days, you could make significant progress in your listening skills? In this episode, we're going to talk about how I improved my English listening in 30 days, and how you can do the same. By listening to real-life stories, you'll not only boost your listening comprehension, but also enhance your writing skills. That's because when you listen closely, you naturally pick up on sentence structures, new vocabulary, and the way ideas flow together. Let me share a quick story with you. A few years ago, I took a trip to Spain. I was thrilled to finally practice my Spanish, but what happened next was totally unexpected. I met a guy named Daniel at a cafe, and we started chatting. At first, I couldn't understand much of what he was saying because he spoke so quickly, and his accent was quite different from what I was used to. But instead of giving up, I made a conscious decision to keep listening carefully. Every time I didn't understand something, I politely asked him to slow down or explain it in a different way. Slowly but surely, I began to understand him better. One day, he shared his experience learning English and how listening to real conversations had made a huge difference for him. It suddenly hit me that's exactly what I was missing, just like him. I decided to shift my focus to listening to everyday conversations instead of solely relying on studying grammar or vocabulary. Over the next few weeks, my listening skills improved dramatically. This experience taught me that improving your listening skills isn't about passively listening to boring language tapes or repeating phrases in isolation. It's about actively engaging with real people, hearing their stories, and practicing active listening. It's the same for your English learning journey. So, why don't we make today's episode your first step toward significantly improving your English listening in just 30 days? You'll have the chance to practice with some real-life stories, just like mine, and learn how to become a better listener. And remember, at the Native Flow English, we upload new videos every day to help you improve your English, covering topics just like this one. Now, let's dive into my journey and see how these small changes led to big results in just 30 days. Let's delve even deeper into my journey of improving English listening in just 30 days. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself sitting in a cafe, just like I did when I was in Spain. You hear people talking all around you, but their words seem like a blur. You catch a few words here and there, but the sentences are flying by too fast. You want to join the conversation, but you're not quite sure if you'll understand what they say. Has this ever happened to you? If so, you're definitely not alone. When I first arrived in Spain, I was excited, but also a bit nervous. I had studied Spanish for months, but when I tried to listen to real people speaking, it felt almost impossible. I distinctly remember ordering coffee on my first day. The waiter asked me something, and I completely froze. My mind was racing, trying to decipher what he was asking. Was he asking if I wanted sugar, milk, or a different size? I honestly had no idea. Instead of responding, I simply smiled and nodded, hoping that whatever he asked wasn't too important. After he walked away, I felt really frustrated with myself. Why was it so difficult to understand spoken Spanish when I had studied the language so much? That moment made me realize something important. Studying words and grammar alone simply wasn't enough. I needed to train my ears to understand natural speech, much like a child learns their first language by listening before they start speaking. So, I made a plan for the next 30 days. I committed to focusing entirely on improving my listening skills. I promised myself that I wouldn't give up, even when I felt confused or overwhelmed. And I'm so glad I did, because what happened next truly changed everything. On the second day of my trip, I met a man named Daniel. He was a local, and we started talking because he was curious about where I was from. Initially, I struggled to understand him. His words seemed to blend together, and his accent was different from what I'd heard in Spanish classes. But instead of getting discouraged, I decided to listen very carefully. I paid close attention to the rhythm of his speech, the way he connected words, and the common phrases he used. I even repeated some of his words in my head to get used to how they sounded. After a few minutes, something amazing happened. My brain started recognizing patterns. I still didn't understand every single word, but I got the general idea of what he was saying. Instead of panicking when I didn't understand something, I simply asked him to repeat things or say them in a different way. He was happy to help, and our conversation continued to flow. That moment gave me so much confidence. I realized that listening wasn't just about knowing every word. It was about understanding the meaning behind the words. That night, I made a list of new words and phrases I had heard during our conversation. Instead of just memorizing them, I found real-life examples of how people used them in everyday conversations. I listened to short audio clips of native speakers and tried to guess the meaning of sentences before checking the translation. I also repeated sentences out loud, trying to copy the way native speakers spoke. This helped me connect listening with speaking, which made learning much easier. By the end of the first week, I noticed a significant change. I could understand more of what people were saying without needing to translate everything in my head. I could follow conversations more easily, even when people spoke quickly. Most importantly, I felt more confident. Before, I was afraid of making mistakes. But now I understood that making mistakes was simply part of the learning process. The more I listened and practiced, the better I got. One of the biggest breakthroughs happened on day 15. I went back to the same cafe where I had struggled on my first day. This time, when the waiter spoke to me, I understood him right away. He asked if I wanted my coffee with sugar or without, and I answered naturally, without hesitation. It felt so good to finally communicate without fear. I wasn't just memorizing words anymore. I was actually using them in real life. This experience taught me some valuable lessons about learning a language. First, listening every day is key to improving. Even if you only understand a little at first, your brain will start recognizing patterns over time. Second, real conversations are the best way to learn. Books and apps can certainly help, but nothing beats listening to actual people speak. And finally, patience is so important. At first, it might feel like you're not making any progress. But if you keep going, you will definitely see results. Now, I want you to think about your own experience with learning English. Have you ever felt frustrated when trying to understand native speakers? Have you ever wanted to join a conversation but held back because you weren't sure if you would understand? If so, I completely understand how you feel. But I promise you, if you follow the right steps, you will improve. Just like I did in Spanish. You can train your ears to understand English naturally. Let's delve even deeper into my experience and explore why listening every day makes such a big difference in your English learning process. If you're serious about improving your English listening skills, you're going to want to pay close attention, because I'm about to share some personal stories, tips, and strategies that can help you make massive progress in just 30 days, just like I did. When I first started learning English, I didn't have the advantage of studying in an English-speaking country, as I did with Spanish in Spain. I didn't have that opportunity to practice with locals, hear the language in different contexts, or really immerse myself in everyday conversations. At first, I relied heavily on textbooks, apps, and grammar exercises. And although I learned a lot of rules, I found it difficult to understand what people were saying when I listened to natural English. It felt overwhelming. Have you ever felt that way when listening to English? You know the words. But the speed and rhythm of real conversations throw you off. I remember a specific moment in my early language learning journey. I was watching a popular TV show, and I thought I had mastered the vocabulary. So I decided to try and watch it without subtitles. But within the first few minutes, I realized how much I was missing. People were speaking quickly, and they used slang and phrases I had never learned. I felt frustrated and a little defeated. It was clear to me that I had a lot of work to do. It wasn't enough to simply understand isolated words or phrases. I needed to understand real conversations, just like you would hear in everyday life. That's when I decided to change my approach. I knew I had to start listening to real-life conversations every day, conversations that sounded like the ones I would have in my everyday life. No more textbook dialogues. No more controlled, slow speech. I needed the real stuff. I started by listening to podcasts, like the one you're listening to now. I would listen to them in the morning while I made my coffee, on my way to work, and sometimes even while I cooked dinner. Even if I didn't understand everything, I didn't stop. I kept listening. At first, it was difficult. I didn't catch much, and I often had to rewind or ask myself questions like, what does that word mean? Or what does this expression really mean in context? But I didn't let it discourage me. Every time I didn't understand something, I wrote it down and researched it later. Slowly, over time, I began to notice patterns in the language. I started recognizing phrases that I had heard repeatedly and could guess their meanings based on the context. One example that stands out is a common phrase used by my friend Daniel when we were in Spain. He would say, "No worries, it's all good." At first, I had no idea what it meant, but after hearing it over and over, I understood it simply meant, "It's okay," or "Don't worry about it." What helped me the most during that time was focusing on context. When you listen to real-life conversations, the context is key. It's not just about hearing individual words. It's about understanding the meaning behind the words. And that's where the magic happens. The more I listened to conversations and paid attention to the context, the more I understood. For example, Daniel used the phrase, "No worries, it's all good," whenever we were having fun or didn't need to worry about something. The context of our relaxed, friendly environment helped me understand what he meant, even though the individual words weren't exactly familiar to me at first. By the third week of this experiment, I had started to notice real improvements. I was understanding conversations with much more ease. I could pick up on tone, mood, and body language, all of which made understanding spoken language so much clearer. It was incredible. I realized that language is so much more than just the words we use. It's about how we communicate feelings and ideas. Listening to real-life stories and conversations helped me understand English in a more natural, fluid way. I also started applying this technique in other areas of my life. For example, I watched movies in English without subtitles, not worrying if I didn't catch every single word. Instead of translating every word into my native language, I tried to understand the overall meaning of the sentence or the scene. This method allowed me to focus on the big picture of communication and helped me understand conversations better. One day, I was sitting in a coffee shop in the United States when I had a conversation with a native English speaker, a woman named Sarah. Sarah had been in the coffee shop for a while, working on her laptop. I noticed she was listening to an audio podcast, much like this one, and I couldn't help but be curious. So I struck up a conversation with her. I asked what she was listening to, and we started talking about the power of listening in learning a new language. She told me that just like me. She had been focusing on listening for the past month to improve her own language skills. She shared how listening to podcasts and watching TV shows helped her understand real-life English. Her story was so inspiring, and I realized that we were both on the same journey of improving our listening skills. In that conversation, something clicked for me. Sarah's English sounded so natural, and I could understand her perfectly because she was speaking at a normal speed. We both agreed that language learning is all about practice, especially practice that involves real-life situations. The more you listen to people speaking naturally, the more your brain starts to connect the dots. After that conversation, I felt more motivated than ever. I increased my listening time even more. I began listening to podcasts during my commute, at the gym, and even while doing household chores. I didn't just listen passively, I actively engaged with the content. For example, if I heard an interesting word or expression, I would pause and repeat it aloud, trying to match the speaker's intonation and rhythm. I would also write down any unfamiliar words and look them up later. This active listening method helped me reinforce new vocabulary and sentence structures. By the end of the 30 days, I felt like a different person. Not only had my listening improved dramatically, but I had also started using the new vocabulary and expressions I had learned in my own conversations. The shift from textbook English to real-life English had made all the difference. I wasn't just learning English, I was living it. Now, I want to challenge you to do the same thing. If you want to improve your English listening and speaking, I encourage you to listen to English every day for 30 days. But make sure you're listening to real conversations, whether it's podcasts, interviews, TV shows, or even everyday interactions. Try to listen to as much real-life English as possible. Don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. The important part is to stay consistent. Every day, take small steps to improve, and your progress will surprise you. The key is to be patient with yourself. Learning a language is a journey, not a race. And just like me, you'll see the benefits of listening every single day. You'll start noticing patterns in the language. Your vocabulary will grow, and your confidence will skyrocket. Most importantly, you'll feel more connected to the language and the world around you, and that's when learning becomes truly fun and rewarding. Remember, here at the Native Flow English, we're committed to helping you improve your English every day. We upload new episodes regularly, so there's always a chance to practice and learn something new. Stay tuned for more tips, real-life stories, and listening practice that can help you achieve your language learning goals. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at how much you can improve. As I kept up with my listening practice, I noticed something really interesting happening. My brain started getting used to the rhythm and flow of the English language. At first, everything had sounded too fast, like a blur of words running together. But after listening every day, my ears adjusted. It was like tuning a radio at first. It's all static. But then suddenly, the voices become clear. One day, I was at a bookstore looking through some travel books when I overheard a conversation between two native English speakers. Normally, I would only catch a few words here and there, but this time, I understood almost everything they were saying. They were talking about an upcoming trip to Italy and discussing where they wanted to go. One of them said, "I can't wait to see the Colosseum in Rome. It's been on my bucket list for years." I immediately recognized the phrase bucket list, which means a list of things you want to do in your lifetime. Just a few weeks before, I wouldn't have known what that meant. But because I had heard it in podcasts and movies, I understood it instantly. That small moment gave me a huge confidence boost. It proved that listening every day was working. I was no longer just memorizing words. I was understanding how they were actually used in real conversations. I started noticing patterns in the way people spoke, how they used contractions like I'm instead of I am, and how they linked words together. For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" many native speakers say it quickly as, "What you doing?" These little details made a big difference in my understanding. Then, something even more exciting happened. I was at a cafe, and the waiter came up to take my order. Normally, I would feel nervous speaking English in a real situation, but that day, I felt different. I had been listening to so many natural conversations that the words just came out without me even thinking too much. I ordered my coffee and even made a little small talk with the waiter. It was a simple conversation, but it felt amazing because I was speaking naturally without translating in my head. That was a huge moment for me, and that's when I realized listening and speaking are connected. The more you listen, the easier it is to speak. When you hear the same phrases and expressions again and again, they become part of your brain's memory. You don't have to think about grammar rules or translations. The words just come out naturally. This is why babies learn to speak before they learn to read or write. They listen for months before they ever say their first words. The same thing happens with adults learning a new language. Listening every day trains your brain to understand and produce the language naturally. After that cafe experience, I wanted to test myself even more. I decided to have a full conversation in English with my friend Daniel, who is a native speaker. Normally, when I spoke English, I felt a little shy or worried about making mistakes. But this time, I reminded myself that I had been listening to English for hours every day. I had heard so many conversations, so many different accents, and so many real-life situations. I told myself, "You can do this." And guess what? The conversation went great. We talked about so many things: travel, work, food, and even funny stories from our childhoods. I noticed that I was speaking faster, using better expressions, and feeling more relaxed. Of course, I still made mistakes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was communicating confidently. That was the moment I truly understood the power of listening. It wasn't just about understanding words. It was about gaining confidence, improving pronunciation, and feeling more comfortable in real conversations. At that point, I wanted to take my learning to the next level. I decided to listen to different types of English news reports, audiobooks, interviews, and even stand-up comedy. Each type of listening gave me something new to learn. For example, when I listened to interviews, I learned how real conversations flow. I noticed that people interrupt each other sometimes, or they use filler words like "you know" and "I mean." This helped me understand the natural rhythm of English. When I listened to audiobooks, I improved my pronunciation because I could hear words clearly and repeat them. I would sometimes pause the audiobook and try to say the same sentence in the same way. It was like having a pronunciation coach right in my ears. And when I listened to comedy, I learned about humor and slang. I didn't always understand the jokes right away, but I didn't give up. I would look up the words I didn't know and try to understand why the joke was funny. Over time, I started getting it, and I felt even more connected to the language. One of my favorite moments was when I watched a stand-up comedy show and actually laughed at a joke before the subtitles even appeared. That was a huge achievement for me because it meant I understood English in real time without needing translations. So here's my advice for you if you want to improve your listening. Make it part of your daily life. Listen while you're cooking, while you're exercising, while you're commuting, anytime, anywhere. The more you surround yourself with English, the faster you'll improve. And don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. That's completely normal. The key is to keep listening. Your brain is learning, even when you don't realize it. Now, let me share one last personal story that really proved to me how much I had improved. A few months after I started my listening routine, I traveled to New York. It was my first time in an English-speaking country, and I was both excited and nervous. On my first day there, I went to a small diner for breakfast. The waitress came up to me and spoke in a fast, casual way. "Hey there, how's it going? What can I get you?" Before my listening practice, I would have frozen in panic. But this time, I understood her completely. I smiled and answered naturally. "I'm good, thanks. I'll have some pancakes and coffee, please." She nodded and said, "Sure thing. You want syrup with that?" Again, I understood instantly and replied, "Yes, please." That conversation may sound simple, but for me, it was a huge success. It showed me that all my listening practice had paid off. I wasn't just memorizing words. I was living the language. So, if you ever feel frustrated with listening, just remember this every time you listen. You're improving. Even if it feels slow, you are making progress. And one day, you'll find yourself in a real-life situation where everything just clicks, and you'll realize how far you've come. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at how much you improve. I know it's easy to get discouraged when you're learning a new language, especially with something as tricky as English. There are so many rules, so many words, and so many different accents and ways people speak. But trust me when I say that the journey is worth it. If you keep at it and focus on one thing like listening, you'll see how quickly things can change. I remember when I first started listening to podcasts, it was something I decided to do because I wanted to get used to hearing real, everyday English. At first, it felt like the speakers were talking too fast, and I was barely catching any words. I would often rewind the podcast and listen to the same sentence over and over again just to try and understand the meaning. But what I learned over time was that repetition. Listening is truly key. It's not about mastering everything right away, but rather exposing yourself to the language repeatedly. As I continued tuning into various podcasts, my brain started to adapt. I began picking up on familiar sounds, patterns, and individual words. Slowly but surely, my comprehension grew. One day, I listened to a podcast episode detailing someone's journey to Japan. The host spoke about visiting Tokyo, savoring sushi, and immersing themselves in Japanese culture. Despite the host's rapid speech, I grasped most of what they were saying because I'd encountered similar words and phrases before. This was a significant breakthrough for me, demonstrating that consistent listening builds knowledge and understanding over time. I still recall a particularly helpful tidbit from that podcast. The host mentioned that Japanese people often bow when greeting one another. I was surprised because I had never really considered the cultural nuances in communication. That small detail helped me recognize the connection between language and culture. As I continued listening to more podcasts, I noticed more of these subtle cultural insights, which made me feel more connected to the language. Listening not only improved my understanding of the language, but it also transformed my perspective on it. I began to appreciate the subtle nuances of speech. For instance, upon hearing someone say, "I've got a lot on my plate today," I learned that this doesn't literally mean having food on your plate. It's a way of expressing that you're busy and have many responsibilities. This kind of knowledge is something you can only acquire through listening to real-life conversations. As my skills improved, I also started recognizing the significance of context in understanding English. One day, while listening to a podcast about personal finance, the host emphasized the importance of saving for retirement. They stated, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me, your future self will thank you." The phrase "trust me" was something I had encountered before in various contexts, but I hadn't fully grasped its deeper meaning until that moment. Now, I realize that people use phrases like this to sound more approachable and reassuring. You see, by listening to different topics and contexts, you start to understand the deeper meaning behind words. You also begin to recognize which words are used in formal versus informal settings. For example, the phrase, "It's never too early to start saving," it's a more formal way of saying, "You should start saving now" in everyday conversation. Listening helps you not only understand what words mean, but also how they're used in different situations. Then, something interesting happened. I started finding it easier to understand English TV shows and movies. Some time ago, I had tried watching an English movie with subtitles, and I struggled to keep up. But now, after months of consistent listening practice, I could watch a movie without relying on subtitles for everything. Of course, there were still some unfamiliar words, but I was able to understand the plot and the jokes without much difficulty. This experience made me realize that listening to real-life conversations is different from simply memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. When you listen to natural speech, you start picking up on things like tone, pauses, and emphasis. For example, the way someone says, "Wow, that's amazing," can reveal a lot about their true feelings, whether they're genuinely impressed or simply being sarcastic. I also started recognizing the importance of understanding accents and dialects. In the beginning, I often got confused by different English accents. For example, the first time I listened to an Australian podcast, I had a hard time understanding the words. But after listening more, I became familiar with the accent and could understand it more clearly. It was like learning a new version of English. And I realized that there are so many different ways to speak the language. So, when I was able to travel to the UK, I felt more prepared. I had practiced listening to different accents, and I wasn't as intimidated by the thought of speaking to a British person. In fact, I found myself chatting with the locals at a cafe without any stress at all. We talked about everything from the weather to their favorite football teams, and I realized how much I had improved. But here's something important to keep in mind. Listening isn't just about understanding words. It's about understanding the meaning behind them. It's about being able to respond naturally in conversations. It's about feeling confident enough to join in and speak up. For example, I remember when I was in a meeting at work. I had to listen carefully to a discussion about a project we were working on. There were several people speaking at once, and they used some technical terms that I wasn't familiar with. But because I had been listening to English for so long, I was able to catch enough of the conversation to understand what was going on. After the meeting, I felt really proud of myself. I had understood most of the discussion, even though some of the words were new to me. It was a big confidence boost because it showed me that listening practice was paying off in real-life situations. As I continued to practice, I also began paying more attention to how people use their voices to convey meaning. For example, I noticed that when people are excited, they tend to speak more quickly and with more energy. When they're sad, their voices become slower and quieter. This is something you can pick up just by listening. You start understanding not only the words, but also the emotions behind them. By this point, I was starting to feel more comfortable speaking English too. I realized that listening wasn't just about hearing the words. It was about training my brain to understand how language works in real situations. The more I listened, the easier it became to speak. I no longer had to search for the right words. I just knew what to say. So, here's another tip. Try to listen to different accents, different voices, and different topics. You'll learn a lot by hearing how people speak in different situations, whether it's a casual conversation, a professional meeting, or a funny joke. Each conversation helps you get one step closer to mastering the language. Listening to real-life stories, like the ones I've shared with you today, can improve your understanding of how language works. You'll start noticing patterns, getting used to different accents, and understanding how context changes the meaning of words. The more you listen, the more you'll feel confident speaking English in your everyday life. Keep practicing, and soon you'll be amazed at how much you've learned just by listening. And trust me, when you can understand and speak English naturally, it opens up a whole new world of opportunities. So stay motivated and keep going. You're making incredible progress. And I'm excited for you to see just how far you can go. As we continue to explore how listening improves your English skills, let me share some more personal experiences that really helped me see the power of listening. One thing I found really surprising was how much I learned about vocabulary simply by listening to real conversations. Sometimes you think you know a word, but when you hear it used in context, it takes on a whole new meaning. I'll give you an example. There's this word broke. I always thought it just meant that someone didn't have any money. That's the simple textbook definition. But one day, I was listening to a podcast about someone's trip to New York, and they said, "I was completely broke after that shopping spree." This wasn't just about not having money. It meant that they had spent so much money on shopping that they had run out of funds. They weren't just describing their financial state. They were explaining the reason for it. This is a small example, but it's a great reminder of why listening to real conversations is so important. It's not just about learning isolated words. It's about learning how those words are used in different situations. When you hear the word broke in a different context, like in a business meeting where someone says, "The company is broke," you start to realize it has more than one meaning, depending on the situation. This is something you won't learn by just memorizing vocabulary lists. You have to listen to how people really use the language. As I got better at listening, I also started noticing how much tone plays a role in communication. You know, in English, the tone of your voice can completely change the meaning of what you're saying. I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. Think about when someone says, "Really?" You can say it in so many ways. You could say it in a curious way, like, "Really?" with your eyebrows raised, asking for more information. Or you could say it in a sarcastic way, like, "Really?" with a roll of your eyes, implying that you don't believe what the other person is saying. When I first started listening to podcasts, I would miss a lot of the tone. I'd focus too much on the words and forget to pay attention to how they were said. But once I started listening more carefully, I began to understand how tone and emotion are connected to the meaning of the words. This made me more aware of how I should speak and what my listeners would understand. It helped me become more natural when I was speaking, too. Another time, I was listening to a podcast about a traveler's experience in Italy. The host told a story about how he got lost in Rome, and he said, "I thought I knew the city, but it turns out the streets in Rome are a maze." That was a simple sentence. But what made it stand out to me was the way he said, "It turns out." He didn't just say, "I got lost in Rome." He added, "It turns out," to explain that. After some thinking, he realized he didn't know as much as he thought. These little phrases, like "it turns out" or "as it turns out," are used so naturally in real conversations. but I would have never learned how to use them if I hadn't been listening to people talk. Over time, I started noticing even more useful phrases that I could use in my own speech. For example, when someone says, "to be honest," they're often about to give their true opinion or feelings, even if it might be hard to hear. So if you say, "To be honest, I didn't enjoy the movie," it's a way of being open and straightforward with the person you're talking to. It's a way of making your message clear and honest, which is something that I think is very important when learning any language. But it wasn't always easy. In fact, there were times when I felt frustrated because I couldn't understand everything I was hearing. One of the most challenging moments I remember was listening to an episode of a podcast where the host was talking about the stock market. I had no idea what they were saying because they used so many business terms I wasn't familiar with. They said things like bull market and bear market, which I had heard before but didn't really understand. Instead of giving up, I decided to do some research on these terms. I found out that a bull market is when the stock market is doing well, and a bear market is when it's doing poorly. Once I understood the meaning of those terms, I went back and listened to the podcast again. This time, I understood much more. I realized that by learning new words and phrases, I could improve my ability to understand more complex topics. This is something I want to highlight for you today. Learning English isn't always about understanding every single word. Sometimes it's about understanding the overall message. It's about learning how to use context to fill in the gaps. So when you're listening to something in English and you don't understand a word, don't panic. Try to understand the sentence's overall meaning. With practice, you'll start noticing patterns and picking up new vocabulary. Another interesting moment happened when I was listening to a podcast about someone's childhood in the United States. The host talked about growing up in a small town and how they would go to the local diner for breakfast every Sunday. I was listening carefully to the details, and something that really stood out to me was how the host described the food. They didn't just say we had breakfast, they used a more vivid description, saying, "We'd sit down to steaming plates of pancakes with maple syrup dripping down the sides." This wasn't just a meal, it was an experience. And by listening to how the host described it, I felt like I was there with them. This taught me the importance of descriptive language. The more you listen to English, the more you start to pick up on ways to describe things vividly and creatively. Whether it's a place, a person, or an experience. Good descriptions can make your speech much more engaging and interesting. I now make an effort to use more descriptive language when I speak. And it makes my conversations more colorful and lively. But of course, it's not just about learning new words or phrases. It's about learning how to connect with people through language. I remember a story I heard on another podcast about a group of friends who traveled to different countries together. They shared stories about their adventures and the challenges they faced while traveling. It wasn't just about what they did. It was about how they connected with each other and communicated in different cultures. This made me realize that English isn't just a tool for communication. It's a way to build relationships and connect with others from different backgrounds. So when you're listening to English, think about the connections you're making. Think about the people behind the words. Each podcast you listen to is an opportunity to learn more about how language brings people together. And as you listen to more and more stories, you'll start feeling like you're part of the conversation too. As I continued listening to podcasts, I noticed that my speaking skills also started to improve. At first, I was nervous about speaking because I thought I wasn't good enough. But after listening to so many different English speakers, I started feeling more confident. I learned how to speak more naturally by paying attention to the way people use pauses, intonation, and rhythm in their speech. Listening helped me understand how to structure my own sentences and how to sound more fluent. One of my favorite things about listening is that it helps you learn how to react in conversations. For example, when someone tells you a funny story, you don't just say, "That's funny." You might say, "No way," "That's incredible," or "I can't believe that happened." These kinds of responses show that you're engaged and interested in the conversation. Listening helps you understand what's appropriate to say and how to say it in a way that sounds natural. Another thing that listening to real stories taught me was how to use humor in conversations. I remember listening to a podcast where the host was telling a funny story about getting lost in the city. The way they told the story was full of humor. They exaggerated things for comedic effect, and I could hear the laughter in their voice. I realized that humor is a huge part of communication. It helps break the ice and makes conversations more enjoyable. I started paying more attention to how humor works in English, and now I use it in my own conversations. Listening to real-life stories like these has been one of the most rewarding experiences in my English learning journey. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary. It's about learning how language is used in real situations. So if you ever feel stuck or frustrated, remember that you're learning more than just words. You're learning how to connect with people, how to share your thoughts, and how to be part of a conversation. As we continue exploring how listening can help improve your English, I want to tell you more about how understanding real-life situations has really shaped my journey. When I started listening to more authentic English content, I began noticing how much language is shaped by the situation. It's not just about using big words or complicated grammar. It's about how people communicate in everyday life. For example, I remember this one time when I was listening to a podcast about a guy talking about his trip to London. He shared a funny experience about trying to find his way to a famous landmark, Big Ben. He said, "I must have asked at least 5 people for directions, and everyone gave me a different answer. By the time I finally got there, I was so lost I felt like I was in a different city." Now, this isn't just a simple travel story. It's a great example of how people use everyday expressions and humor in real conversations. When he said, "I must have asked at least 5 people," he didn't just tell you he asked 5 people. He used must have to show that it was definitely more than just a few people. It's something I now use in my own conversations. If I want to say I've done something more than once, or I've been really busy, I might say, I must have spoken to 20 people today. It's a more natural way to exaggerate a situation and make it sound real. This also made me realize how much we use our own experiences to connect with others. The host wasn't just telling a boring fact about his trip. He was sharing his feelings, how he was confused, lost, and frustrated. By listening to how he shared those emotions, I began to see how important it is to add personality to your language. It's not just about getting the right words, it's about how you say them. The story was not only about what happened, but how the guy felt. And that's what makes it interesting to listen to. Another great example happened when I was listening to a podcast about someone's experience at a wedding. The speaker said, "I went to this wedding last weekend, and let me tell you, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The couple was so in love. You could feel it in the air. The ceremony was beautiful, and everyone was crying." This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the emotions involved. When the speaker said you could feel it in the air, they were giving us a strong mental image. This is what listening can teach you: how to make something vivid and engaging. For a while, I didn't know how to express emotions like that. I would simply say it was nice, or it was beautiful. But after listening to that wedding story, I started using phrases like, "you could feel it in the air," or "the energy was amazing." These phrases don't just describe something. They help you see it in your mind. They help you feel it. And I learned that in real-life situations, these expressions are more powerful than just simple adjectives. I think that's the beauty of listening. You start to hear how people connect their words to their feelings, which makes the conversation come to life. I also remember listening to an interview with someone who had lived abroad for a few years. The speaker explained how they missed home during their first year in a new country. They said, "At first, I was excited to be in a new place, but after a few months, I started to miss the little things, like the smell of fresh bread baking in the morning." I remember how that story made me feel nostalgic about my own home, even though it was about someone else's experience. That's the power of language. It's not just words on a page. It's about how those words make you feel. And listening to these stories helps you connect with the emotions behind the language. If you want to sound more natural when speaking English, you have to be able to describe how things make you feel. You can't just say, "I like this," or "it's good." Instead, you can say things like, "It made me feel happy," or "I felt like I was home again." It makes your speech more emotional and relatable. Another important thing I learned from listening to podcasts is how much we rely on context in conversations. I'll give you an example. There was a story about a guy who was describing his job. He said, "I work in an office with a lot of meetings." At first, it was overwhelming, but now I know how to handle it. Now, this sentence might sound simple, but what struck me was the use of "handle it." This phrase isn't just about managing work. It's about dealing with challenges. When you use handle in a conversation, it gives the impression that you've learned to deal with something difficult, which is often what happens in everyday life. At first, I didn't know how to express myself like this. But as I listened to people talk about their struggles or successes, I realized how important it is to use the right words to show how you feel about something. Instead of just saying, "It was hard," you can say, "I had to handle a lot of things," or "It took some time to get used to it." These little shifts in language make your speech sound more natural and fluent. There's also a lot of value in listening to people tell stories about their hobbies and passions. One story I listened to was about someone who was obsessed with photography. They said, "Every weekend, I spend hours walking around the city, taking photos of anything that catches my eye. I don't even care if people think I'm strange. I love it." This was such a great example of how to express your passion for something. It wasn't just about the activity, it was about how it made the person feel. They didn't just say, "I like photography." They said, "I love it," and they went on to explain why. Learning how to express your passion is another key thing I picked up from listening. Whether you're talking about your favorite hobby, a book you just finished, or a new skill you're learning, it's important to show excitement and energy in your speech. Instead of saying, "I like playing football," you could say, "I'm really into football. I spend hours playing every week, and I can't get enough of it." These little changes make your speech more dynamic and interesting. And let's not forget about the power of stories that make us laugh. There was a podcast episode about a comedian who was sharing funny moments from their life. One of the best stories was about their first time performing on stage. They said, "I was so nervous. I forgot my own jokes. But I still managed to make the audience laugh by just being myself." The way they told the story was so funny, and you could totally hear how much they were enjoying themselves while sharing it. That really showed me how important it is to bring some humor into conversations. Even when you're talking about serious stuff, humor can lighten the mood and make things more enjoyable. Plus, it helps people connect with you on a personal level. Listening to those kinds of stories has really helped me, not only to get better at English, but also to understand how to use language in a way that connects with people. And that's what I want to share with you today. As you listen to more of these real-life stories and examples, you'll see that language isn't just about rules or grammar. It's about connecting with others and sharing your own experiences in a way that feels natural and genuine. I think one of the most eye-opening things I discovered while listening to real stories was how important it is to be able to share your personal experiences in a way that others can relate to. That's something you learn by really paying attention to how people talk about their own lives. There was this one podcast episode I listened to where the speaker talked about a really tough period in their life. They said, "A few years ago, I hit rock bottom. I had lost my job. My relationships were falling apart, and I didn't know what to do next. But after a lot of thinking, I decided to start fresh. I didn't know how it would go, but I decided to go for it. When I heard that, I didn't just hear someone sharing their personal story. I heard someone talking about the courage it takes to make a change. And that's what I want to share with you. Listening to real stories isn't just about hearing what people went through. It's about understanding how they processed those moments and what they did to overcome the challenges. I found myself thinking, wow, that's something I could do too. It's those kinds of moments that teach us how to express ourselves better in English. Because they show us the kinds of phrases people use to talk about their struggles and their triumphs. For example, when the speaker said, "I hit rock bottom," I understood that they were talking about a really low point in their life, but they also showed resilience with, "I decided to start fresh." That's exactly how we speak in real life. We don't just give details, we share how we felt, what changed, and what we decided to do. It's those kinds of emotional expressions that add depth to conversations. And that's why listening to real-life stories is so important for improving your English. The same goes for stories about success. I once listened to a story about a guy who had started his own business from scratch. He said, "I started with nothing, no money, no experience, and no connections. But I had an idea and a dream. I took it step by step, faced a lot of failures, but kept pushing forward. Now I'm running a successful company with hundreds of employees." Listening to that story taught me something valuable. Success doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that involves hard work, setbacks, and a lot of determination. But what stood out to me was how he told the story. He didn't just say, "I started a company." He said, "I started with nothing, and I kept pushing forward." These phrases show the effort he put in and the struggle he went through. Those are the kinds of expressions that make your language more powerful. When you're telling your own story, whether it's about starting a new job, moving to a new country, or learning a new skill, you want to capture those emotions. You want to show the highs and lows, the challenges and the victories. That's how you engage your listeners and make them feel connected to your experience. In addition to success stories, I've also learned so much from listening to people talk about their everyday experiences. Oh, these stories might seem simple, but they are filled with language that we use all the time. For example, I heard a story about a woman who talked about her routine. She said, "Every morning, I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run. It's how I start my day, and it helps me clear my mind." I realized how powerful those small details are. When we talk about our routines, we're not just describing what we do. We're also showing our values and what's important to us. That story taught me how to share personal habits in a more natural and engaging way. Instead of just saying, "I wake up early," I could say, "I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run." This gives the listener more information and helps them picture what your day looks like. I also started noticing how people use language to describe their emotions in different situations, One podcast episode featured someone explaining how they dealt with a stressful situation at work. They said, "I had a huge presentation coming up, and I was really nervous. But instead of letting my nerves control me, I decided to take a deep breath, focus, and do my best. And you know what? It went better than I expected." That example helped me understand how we use language to talk about challenges. The speaker used, "I was really nervous" to express their anxiety. But then they used, "I decided to take a deep breath" to show how they took control of their emotions. That shift in language from expressing fear to showing confidence was really powerful. It taught me how to talk about my own emotions in different situations. For instance, I used to say, "I'm nervous about my presentation," but now I say, "I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to focus and do my best." This shows a change in mindset, and it sounds more positive. Instead of focusing on the fear, I'm focusing on the solution. That's a shift in both language and attitude, and it's something you can practice in your own conversations. Listening to those kinds of stories can also help you understand how people use humor to deal with difficult situations. For example, I heard a story about someone who was caught in a rainstorm without an umbrella. They said, "I was drenched, looking like I just stepped out of a swimming pool. But the best part was seeing people look at me like I was the one who caused the rain. It was hilarious." Humor is such a great tool in language because it makes things feel lighter and more enjoyable. When you listen to how people tell funny stories, you start to pick up on the little details that make those stories funny. For instance, instead of just saying, "It rained," the speaker added, "I looked like I just stepped out of a swimming pool," which makes it more vivid and relatable. And the phrase, "looking like I was the one who caused the rain," adds humor to the situation. Now, I try to use humor in my own conversations, especially when things don't go as planned. For example, if I'm running late, I might say, "I'm already 10 minutes late, but I'm hoping I can still make it before they finish the meeting." This adds a little humor and makes the conversation feel more relaxed. It also makes it more engaging for the listener. Another example comes from a podcast where the speaker talked about their love for cooking. They said, "I've been trying to cook more lately, but I always end up burning something. The other day, I accidentally burned my breakfast, but I just laughed and made myself some cereal instead." What I loved about this story was the attitude the speaker had. They didn't let a small mistake ruin their day. They laughed about it and moved on. That's something we can all learn from. When things don't go perfectly, it's okay to laugh and find a way to fix it. The way the speaker told the story made it feel lighthearted, and it reminded me that not everything has to be perfect, and that's what makes real conversations enjoyable. The imperfections. In all of these examples, I've learned something important about language. It's not just about what we say, it's about how we say it. When you listen to real-life stories, you start to hear the nuances in language. You hear how people express their feelings, their humor, and their experiences. You pick up on the small details that make a big difference in how we communicate. And this is why listening is so important. It's through listening to real conversations and stories that we learn how to express ourselves in ways that are both natural and engaging. You don't have to memorize vocabulary or study grammar rules to sound like a native speaker. Instead, focus on listening to how people talk about their own lives. Pay attention to the expressions they use, the emotions they convey, and the stories they tell. By listening more to real conversations, you'll start to hear how English is used in everyday life. You'll notice how people connect with each other through their stories, how they use humor to lighten the mood, and how they share their feelings and experiences. And when you start using those same expressions and phrases in your own conversations, you'll sound more confident, natural, and fluent. I think one of the most eye-opening things I discovered while listening to real stories was how important it is to be able to share personal experiences in a way that others can relate to. That's something you learn by really paying attention to how people talk about their own lives. There was this one podcast episode I listened to where the speaker talked about a difficult period in their life. They said, "A few years ago, I hit rock bottom. I had lost my job. My relationships were falling apart, and I didn't know what to do next. But after a lot of thinking, I decided to start fresh. I didn't know how it would go, but I decided to go for it." When I heard that, I didn't just hear someone sharing their personal story. I heard someone talking about the courage it takes to make a change. And that's what I want to share with you. Listening to real stories isn't just about hearing what people went through. It's about understanding how they process those moments and what they did to overcome the challenges. I found myself thinking, wow, that's something I could do too. It's those kinds of moments that teach us how to express ourselves better in English because they show us the kinds of phrases people use to talk about their struggles and their triumphs. For example, when the speaker said, "I hit rock bottom," I understood that they were talking about a really low point in their life, but they also showed resilience with, "I decided to start fresh." That's exactly how we speak in real life. We don't just give details. We share how we felt, what changed, and what we decided to do. It's those kinds of emotional expressions that add depth to conversations. And that's why listening to real-life stories is so important for improving your English. The same goes for stories about success. I once listened to a story about a man who had started his own business from scratch. He said, "I started with nothing, no money, no experience, and no connections. But I had an idea and a dream. I took it step by step, faced a lot of failures, but kept pushing forward. Now I'm running a successful company with hundreds of employees." Listening to that story taught me something valuable. Success doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that involves hard work, setbacks, and a lot of determination. But what stood out to me was how he told the story. He didn't just say, "I started a company." He said, "I started with nothing, and I kept pushing forward." These phrases show the effort he put in and the struggle he went through. Those are the kinds of expressions that make your language more powerful. When you're telling your own story, whether it's about starting a new job, moving to a new country, or learning a new skill, you want to capture those emotions. You want to show the highs and lows, the challenges and the victories. That's how you engage your listeners and make them feel connected to your experience. In addition to success stories, I've also learned so much from listening to people talk about their everyday experiences. These stories might seem simple, but they are filled with language that we use all the time. For example, I heard a story about a woman who talked about her routine. She said, "Every morning, I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run. It's how I start my day, and it helps me clear my mind." I realized how powerful those small details are. When we talk about our routines, we're not just describing what we do. We're also showing our values and what's important to us. That story taught me how to share personal habits in a more natural and engaging way. Instead of just saying, "I wake up early," I could say, "I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run." This gives the listener more information and helps them picture what your day looks like. I also started noticing how people use language to describe their emotions in different situations. One podcast episode featured someone explaining how they dealt with a stressful situation at work. They said, "I had a huge presentation coming up, and I was really nervous. But instead of letting my nerves control me, I decided to take a deep breath, focus, and do my best. And you know what? It went better than I expected." That example helped me understand how we use language to talk about challenges. The speaker used "I was really nervous" to express their anxiety. But then they used "I decided to take a deep breath" to show how they took control of their emotions. That shift in language from expressing fear to showing confidence was really powerful. It taught me how to talk about my own emotions in different situations. One of the things I realized as I listened to more stories and conversations was how important context is in language. When you're learning English, it's easy to focus on individual words or grammar rules. But the real magic happens when you understand the situation behind the words. When I told this story, it wasn't just about explaining how I became a teacher. It was about the emotions I felt, nervousness, pride, and the satisfaction of helping others. That's the magic of storytelling. You can turn a simple experience into something meaningful by adding emotion and context. And that's what makes learning English so exciting. It's not just about mastering vocabulary. It's about learning how to tell your story in a way that makes an impact. So, when you're practicing English, think about the stories you want to tell. Think about the experiences in your life that have shaped you, the moments that have taught you something important, and the emotions you felt along the way. And then, practice sharing those stories in English. The more you practice, the better you'll become at expressing yourself. you'll learn to communicate not just with words, but with the emotions and experiences that make you, you. I hope today's episode helped you see that learning English isn't just about memorizing words or rules. It's about expressing yourself, connecting with others, and sharing your story in a way that's meaningful. Remember, it's okay to make mistakes along the way. Each mistake is a step forward in your learning journey. The more you listen to real-life stories and practice speaking, the more confident you'll become in your ability to communicate in English. So keep pushing yourself, be patient, and enjoy the process. Every little improvement is worth celebrating. Thanks for joining me today on the Native Flow English. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I can't wait to share more real-life stories and language tips with you in the next one. Keep practicing, keep learning, and remember, English is a journey, not a destination. Until next time, take care.